Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. It's just over a decade since Egypt's revolution that started with a wave of protest in Cairo's Tahrir Square and formed part of what we now refer to as the Arab Spring. While international media attention has followed the post-revolutionary politics of Egypt and the region, we have paid less attention to the subtle but powerful developments in Egyptian society. How have the people of Cairo lived in and interpret their realities? How have artists and writers responded personally and artistically to the various stages of the political transformation? Those are the questions that drive a new book, Creating Spaces of Hope, Young Artists and the New Imagination in Egypt, by Caroline Seymour-Jorn. Caroline is an associate professor of comparative literature and Arabic translation at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I'm very happy that she joins me now to discuss her book. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Pierre.
Thank you so much for joining me, Caroline. Well, your book is an incredibly rich and detailed and very, very subtle as well account of a range of artistic practices that have been emerging in Cairo over the last 10 years. But before we get into any of those details, I'd like to ask you about your own trajectory and how you came to be in Cairo, how you came in contact with all those artists. And
Well, actually, I've been traveling to Cairo and spending time in the city for quite a while now. Initially, went in 1987 to learn Arabic. I or to learn advanced Arabic. I had already done a degree in Arabic at the university, and even in those early days in the late 80s. I started to get interested in artists and creators. I had friends who took me to a variety of studios and introduced me to various kinds of artists, sculptors, and painters, and so on. But my focus in the early days that I spent in Cairo in the early 1990s was research on writers, on women writers. I did a book called Cultural Criticism in Egyptian Women's Writing, which focused on a group of women who started publishing and became rather well published during the 1970s. And so I looked at their novels and their short stories with sort of a two-pronged approach. I tried to look at aesthetic innovations that they were making, literary innovations, along with critiques, social and political critiques
Mhm.
that they were making as well. And so some of the literary innovations I was looking at were things like how writers moved between colloquial language and the formal literary Arabic. I looked at how they included women's language, popular
Mhm.
expressions, and a sort of very colloquial sort of language and the topics that women talk about. I looked at how they used intertextuality in various ways, drawing on the Quran or various other texts to talk about women's lives and to talk about the ways that women fit into society and
Mhm.
politics in Egypt. During that period when I was doing research on writers, I spent a lot of time in central Cairo, in the area not far from Tahrir Square and Talat Harb Square, where there are many cafes that artists and writers hang out in. There's an atelier there. There are places people go to in the evenings, studios. And as I sort of kind of hung out in that world, getting to know
Mhm.
people and doing interviews and arranging interviews, I met many artists, many studio artists. And it was very clear to me that the world of artists and writers was very intertwined in the city.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate to make some very good friends actually in that circle of people, um, and go to many different kinds of exhibits and visit artists and studios. And although I never, at that time in the early 1990s, I never really thought about focusing on artists, I maintained my interest and my contacts. And when the revolution happened, it became very clear to me that artists, whether we're talking studio artists, writers, musicians, street or public artists, they were doing some of the most interesting creative
Mm.
production during that period around 2011 and the years after.
It's fascinating. From my memory of working with European artists running up to 2011, Cairo was always seen from London and from Europe as this kind of almost utopian
Yes.
melting pot of
Yes.
creativity and literature, the kind of
Hmm.
thing that we still associate maybe with Bohemian Paris,
Yes.
but is no longer reproduced under the conditions of neoliberal capitalism in the West.
Right.
So
Right.
it's fascinating to hear that you had that experience
Yeah.
before that watershed moment.
It's a very exciting part of the city because, despite the fact that, there are economic problems and political problems in the city, people are just so active. I think the
Mm.
artists, intelligentsia are so active. Um, there's always something going on. So it's a very exciting, energizing kind of place. So I can
Mm.
understand why in Europe, artists and writers in Europe would see it that way.
I think this is fascinating because I think we'll come back to both the benefits and the difficulties of that kind of framing in a moment.
Yes.
But maybe it'll be worthwhile spending just a minute giving a bit of a sketch of the revolution and the political and the social situation in Cairo and Egypt from
Hmm.
2011 and on. I imagine most of our listeners will have the broad outline of January 2011 revolution, but it would be great if you could maybe begin to give us a flavor of how you see society has been responding to the changes and how
Hmm.
what
Sure.
your artists are living through.
Yes. Well, of course, prior to the 2011 revolution, Hosni Mubarak had been the president of Egypt for 30 years, quote unquote, elected. But yeah, there was no real democracy. There was no real democratic elections going on there. And it was a very repressive regime.
Mm,
People were very frustrated with lack of freedoms, with restrictions on media. The economy was, really quite bad, and people were, struggling to put food on the table. Although there
mm,
were people who had become very wealthy due to sort of neoliberal capitalist changes in the city. There, the gap between the wealthy and the poor was getting larger and larger all the
yeah,
time. And there had been a number of, it wasn't that 2011 happened all of a sudden. There had been a number of revolutionary episodes before that, including the Kefaya movement, which means enough. So the sort of background is a background of frustration and people being sort of fed up. And when the 2011 revolution came, people, they came to Tahrir, they came to the squares around. Tahrir is the central square,
yes.
of course, in Cairo, but they came to other squares. People demonstrated in other towns and cities as well, and called for democracy. And what was so interesting about it was that it was a very diverse group of people that protested.
Mm,
It was men and women, it was wealthy and poor, it was educated and uneducated, seculars, liberals, fundamentalists, you name it. They were all in the square together. There was a period of time after 2011, when there was sort of a transitional period where the Supreme Council of Armed Forces took control. People thought that there was going to be democratic elections that would be held, and people were very excited about that, but ultimately disappointed in what happened, which was more or less a continuation of
mm,
the Mubarak regime, and then the installation of the current president, El Sisi. So I would say, when you ask me what people have lived through, I think I would say they lived through tremendous hope and joy about the possibility of increased democracy and a different kind of society. They've lived through the disappointment of that not happening. They recognize that what happened in Egypt politically, what's been happening, is part of a larger geopolitical scene in
yeah.
which outside actors, including the U.S., contribute to the political situation there. Um, but I think what's amazed me, perhaps more than anything else, is that people think that the revolution was a good thing. Even people after the disappointments, they think that it was good for young people to have a taste of what it means to be able to say their minds, to have those moments in Tahrir Square, and to understand what political participation is. So I would say that people are still in some ways hopeful, although also frustrated with the current situation as well.
Yeah, and all of this plays itself out in the book and the case studies that you compose it around. And maybe we just start with a very broad overview of what it is that you do in the text. You have conducted what seemed to me incredibly in-depth, both kind of anthropological and ethnographic studies of a series of artistic projects and individual artists, but also you've gone in great amount of depth and detail into the analysis of a range of artistic works. And what I really appreciate about your work is that you've brought together a kind of community art dramatic project. You've brought together a couple of studio artists, two writers, and also engage with street art.
Hmm.
And together, these things form a incredibly rich picture. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your approach to the method and what's important about giving this amount of space to
Hmm.
the personal experiences of artists.
Well, I am trained as an anthropologist, so I've always sort of been taught to think about the context in which an individual
Mm,
operates, um, the way that they've thought about their lives and their activities, their personal history. But I've also been a person who's always been interested in art as well. And so I've tried to bring those two things together. What's interesting, I think, sort of traditionally in Western academia was that literary criticism and art criticism tended to be very removed from personal discussion of the artist,
mhm,
him or herself. It was sort of the idea of thinking about the artist was sort of an old fashioned way of or thinking about the artist's personal history was sort of an old fashioned way of approaching art and literature. Rather, the idea is to focus on the work itself, literary or artistic techniques, um, and interpretation in those terms. But because I'm trying to work in between anthropology and art or literary criticism, I try to kind of merge the perspectives. And I think it's very interesting because really my main goal is to educate Westerners about the richness of what's going on in the art world in Cairo and in the Middle East. Because I think I can't speak for Europe really, but in the US, I think people tend to be very ignorant about the Middle East. They don't know that there's this rich
mm.
artistic and literary world, and there's a lot of stereotypical thinking about the region. So my aim is to educate about that richness, but also to help people understand the humanity of the artistic creators as well, who they are as people, how they came to their work, what it means to them from a social, political, cultural perspective. And I would say that the literary and sort of artistic critical standards are a bit different in the U.S. Or in the West and in Egypt, if I can generalize in those ways. In that, in Egypt and the Middle East, artists and writers who engage in relatively direct political or social or cultural critique, but also engage in aesthetic innovation are very much valued and appreciated, whereas I think kind of more direct social political critique
Mm.
in the West tends to be looked at as sort of a diminished value when it comes to literature.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting, and I think that's a question that again pops up in the book time and time again. And I think we'll experience this in a moment when we start speaking about individual practices. But I wanted to ask you before that about your choice of framing that seems to quite programmatically evade any preconceived Western notions of what it is, what Arabic, Middle Eastern art might be, but also the very Western notion of what political art is. So you just mentioned that there is a way in which, in certain critical discourses, political art is not necessarily top priority,
Right.
but quite conversely, in European, maybe less so American art history discourse or contemporary art critique, the political is king.
Hmm.
So there is a tendency, which I've observed, maybe it's died down now, but in relationship to Egypt in particular, up to 2011, 12, the political potential of art was the only thing that the critics in Europe were interested in.
Yes. Mhm.
But you kind of eschew that
Mhm.
for a couple of reasons, and I think one of them is just certain sensitivities that continue to exist within
Mhm.
those practices,
Mhm.
and second is just that those kind of external frames are just not necessarily very productive. So,
Mhm.
at the risk of having just put all these words in your mouth, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about what it is that critically avoiding the Western preconceived notions
Yeah.
can produce for you.
Right. This is an idea that I started working with in my book about Egyptian literary writers, that, Western scholars tend to want to look at Middle Eastern creativity, whether it's literature or art, as a form of resistance, as a form of
Mm,
political resistance. So, so many books have been written about, say, for example, women's fiction, that focus on the way that these writers critique gender norms, critique the way that marriage and family building happens in the Middle East, what it does to women's lives. And these are important things. However, I think often when there's a focus on analysis of art or literature as resistance, as a political statement, we risk losing some of the most important things that the creator is trying to do, which is the
mm,
experimentation with language, or in the case of the work in this book, creating spaces of hope, experimentation in musical form, artists with materials and ideas, experimentation with, in the case of the filmmaker Bassem Yousri, for example, experimentation with ideas of intercultural understanding and sort of existential issues of how do human beings really understand each
mm,
other. So I wanted to move away from an exclusive focus on the politics, although politics of the region are fascinating, right?
yeah.
But it's not the only thing that artists are talking about, and I think they want to be recognized for the other things as well.
Well, let's get right into it. I think it's high time we talked about some examples, and I was going to try to introduce the choir project, but I've realized that it's a little bit too complicated for me to do it much justice, and that it became clear in some of our conversations earlier that the terminology really mattered. But
Yes, well, the choir project was begun actually just before the 2011 revolution by Salam Yusri, who is a fascinating individual. He comes from an artistic family. He is a very accomplished painter as well as a musician. And he began the choir project in 2010. He got a group of he basically put out a Facebook call for people to come and participate in this collaborative choir experience, in which the group would not only collaboratively create the lyrics of songs, but they would also create the music, the tunes. And he did have, I think, one or two professional musicians who would come, and he's a drummer. So, for example, he would do the drumming, and I think he had an accordionist and also somebody who had sung professionally as a way of sort of guiding these individuals. But basically, it was about bringing people together and allowing them to create a song about something that they want to think about, to talk about, and do it in a way that draws on each individual's creative abilities. That's how they started, and then it's gone on really until the present, with these calls out to create different choirs involving different groups of people. And more recently, they actually did a theatrical production called Zubeida. I was particularly interested in it because I had actually known Salam for quite a while, and when he started to talk to me about this, I realized that it was such a unique thing to be doing in Cairo. Well, most of the people who came were young people, so it allowed people to talk about the issues of youth, how they are understood or not understood by the older generation, things they thought about their city, In fact, the very first presentation they did was called the Cairo Complaints Choir. Um,
That is
Choral
priceless.
Shakawi al-Qahira.
I hope there's a list of complaints
Y-
published somewhere.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. And they talk in fairly elliptical terms about, some of the economic and social problems of the city. Of course, uh, issues that are not unique to Cairo in particular, but they were very clever in the way that they used colloquial language, the way that they used rhyme, the way they referred to media, for example, the way they talk about the influence, say, for example, of Western politics on their own nation. It was, for me, a very fascinating and kind of unique intervention. And then it was also very interesting to me that it became so popular that Salem Yusri was invited to do these kind of workshops, abroad in London and Munich and Paris and Berlin. I mean, he's been all over the place, and including to the U.S. and including in many different cities and towns in Egypt too.
Hmm. I'd like us to find a way to play in as a song, but I need your help in choosing which one.
Sure, absolutely. I think in the area that you're talking about is the no comment performance, which was one that I was very lucky to be able to attend in Cairo in January of 2012, and this was held in an old sort of warehouse building, um, not too far from central Cairo. And it was a very this was so it- you know this was a year after the revolution. It was a very exciting time, and kind of in some ways sort of scary time to be in Cairo as well, because things were still sort of unstable. But at this particular evening, this no comment performance was the culmination of I guess about a week or 10 days of practice in which these young people got together to create a series of songs. I guess they created just one song through that particular workshop. But the night I came, then they sang a variety of other songs as well. And it is basically a revolution narrative, but very clever because they talk about the revolution, but in a way that's making very clever use of rhyme, alliteration, repetition. They really get at both the joy and the sort of ecstatic moments of the revolution, and then also some of the more difficult moments as well.
وسط الزحمة للسهلة اثبت اثبت اوعى تخاف وسط الزحمة للسهلة اثبت اثبت اوعى تخاف وسط الزحمة للسهلة اثبت اثبت اوعى تخاف وسط الزحمة للسهلة اثبت اثبت اوعى تخاف
لو مات واحد يجي آلاف
So, Caroline, you've kindly offered to maybe read for us, both in Arabic and in English, some of the lyrics of this song, and that could maybe be a beautiful way to get into some of the analysis that you've hinted at.
Maybe just the start of the song from the no comment performance. Um, the beginning of the song reads like this in Arabic, and um, of course it sounds much more dramatic and lovely as sung by the choir, but I'll let you have a sense of what it sounds like in Arabic. And this is colloquial Egyptian. قبل الفجر في طلعة حرب وقت ما كنا في عز الضرب كنت أنا ماشي لقيت شعبين واحد منهم قرب مني قال لي يا كابتن ممكن أولع قلت اتفضل قال طاب تشكر. This translates to just before dawn in Talat Harb, when we were in the heat of the battle. I was walking and came across two young men. One of them came up to me. He said, "Hey, Captain, can I get a light?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Great, thanks." This so when I translated them, I tried to stay very close to the meaning and I didn't add in any rhyming, which takes away from the experience. But what I thought was important about this entry to this particular song is that he gets at the um, camaraderie of the youth, what happened in Talat Harb. The young people, they really came together. They recognized their common experience as young Egyptians, both the warmth of ordinary human interaction in Cairene society, but also the frustration and the fear and the hope that went into the beginning of that revolution. Egyptian society is people are extraordinarily friendly and warm. So very everyday interactions are tend to be very warm and very almost sort of intimate. And even if you're a foreigner and you can speak Arabic, you are included in this in a way that people sort of welcome you into their experience. And I thought that was part of what this choir was getting at here, that even though it was a revolutionary situation and a moment of danger coming up, he's still talking about the way a group of young men will just come up to each other. They don't know each other, but they're friendly and they smoke a cigarette together and that kind of thing.
Another thing that I really appreciated about your analysis, and clearly your anthropological training comes into the fore, is that you looked at the work of the choir not only as an artwork per se, but quite simply as a social grouping.
Hmm.
And you've interviewed plenty of the
Hmm.
participants. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the functions that participating in the choir
Yes.
has for them.
Yes. Yeah. I did interview a number of participants who were involved in different choir workshops. And it was interesting because I interviewed very young people who were in their 20s, and also there were some older participants as well, one person in her 70s. The younger people, particularly right around the revolution, they were so excited and joyous about the possibilities of the revolution that participating in these choirs was just sort of a way of sharing their excitement and their hopes of what may come, but also it was a way of sharing what happened on the street in Tahrir Square, because of course revolutions are never simply exciting and hopeful. They're also violent, and there was violence in Tahrir Square. There, the although the demonstrators were peaceful for the most part, the vast majority of cases, there was violence on the part of government security forces. So it was a way of the young people talking about what it was like to be in Tahrir, what it was like to have this communal experience with people they knew, people they didn't know, people who were like them, people who they'd never met before. Other people told me that going to those choir project experiences was a way of breaking out of their ordinary kind of social roles. Egypt is a class
Mhm.
based society, and so it's true that educated people often tend to mostly socialize with educated people and less educated people, and so on. People kind of stay within their socioeconomic class to a certain extent. So people told me that being in the choir project was rich because it allowed them to meet people they never would have met under ordinary circumstances. It allowed secular individuals to meet people who had a more sort of religious orientation. It allowed people to meet people outside of their socioeconomic class, their educational class, and so on. Those were some of the things that people told me.
Hmm. So it clearly performs quite a profound function
Yes, I
for the
think so.
participants. I wonder if this is a moment to look at your title specifically, because you just mentioned that the choir project is a space in which people can continue with the hope of the revolution still
Hmm.
bringing some kind of positive outcome. And I'm sure
Yes.
these things change with time. How do you see spaces of hope, and
Hmm.
what does culture have to do with hope and kind of instituting
Hmm.
space for hope within a social context of a place like Cairo?
Yeah, well, I can give you a very concrete example from the choir project. For example, one of the young men that I interviewed about the choir project told me that, you know, in the post revolutionary period in more recent years, he's participated in the choir project. And he said it really allowed him to sort of maintain some sense of the jubilance, of the early revolutionary period. And he said that he was disappointed about the revolution, it failed, but when he went to the choir project, he said, I get back the smell and the spirit of the revolution. Even though we don't talk politics, I get the spirit of freedom. I forget my problems, like I'm flying in the air. So it's I think that that's one way in which people can experience hope within this context, that they're still getting together with other people. They're still creating something new. They get to express themselves freely. They get to hear what other people think about their own ideas and creative production. And from what I gathered when I spoke to it, the participants, that in itself was really validating for people to get a chance to talk, to share, to create, and to get feedback. Even if it's small, even if it's not creating any huge social change, it's still a really profound moment of human interaction.
I mean, yeah, that's clearly incredibly important, and a lot of the practices you describe, you cite, I recall, one of the critics who described the young generation of Cairo as the generation that has nothing more left to lose,
Yes,
and there's a sense in which this kind of creative and cultural participation is the thing you identify as an antidote to that
yes.
kind of. Let's move on to another art form, as you do in your Whirlwind book. And the next section in the book is devoted to three visual artists, studio artists. The one that you open with is Hani Rasheed, born in 1975. Like quite a few of the creatives that you bring up, not trained as an artist, originally an engineer.
Hmm.
Another one of those artists who has an active international career,
Hmm.
described by one of the critics you cite as a king of pop art, which I think is an accolade that we might have to do a little bit to justify. I've put links to the portfolio of the artist in the show notes, and listeners will be able to go and look at the work at the same time. So please do that. So if I could ask you to describe some of the works of Hani Rashid that you look at in the book and try to place them in a context maybe as well of what is happening in the Cairo gallery and visual arts scene.
Hani Rashid is, yes, a very fascinating artist because of some of the things you said. Again, he was originally trained as an engineer, but sort of taught himself how to draw, and then eventually was just sort of discovered and mentored by a very well-known Egyptian artist by the name of Muhammad Abla. He came at his art from a very unorthodox sort of background, and he's a multimedia artist. I mean, he works in painting and printmaking, in wood and plastic and gypsum, and so each one of his exhibitions that I've seen, each one of his collections are really quite different. And in a fascinating way, he's also got. He's also quite influenced by sort of surrealist perspectives as well. One of his early and very well known projects was called Toys. So he creates these little figurines of people, basically images that might be seen on the street in everyday life in Cairo. So people on motorcycles, people walking, they're created out of plastic and wood. And they're meant to really sort of represent people in ordinary everyday life. Whether they're riding in a tuk-tuk, which is a small three-wheeled vehicle that is particularly useful in a crowded city or on non-paved street, for example. But the pieces are also they're stray cats and so on, and get them to look both so real and ordinary and so shrunken and distorted at the same time. And I argue also in my analysis of this that, he's trying to get at the fact that human life in society, um, in cultures, in social systems are are distorted by the systems, the norms that rule human behavior. That's part of what he's sort of getting at in these distorted figures that he creates. But he's also sort of getting at the way in which human beings could be seen as toys that are sort of played with by these larger cultural and social
Mm.
systems or um, norms. It's an interesting way of thinking about um, human independence and the ways in which human beings think they may be independent and going about life in their own way, but they're really not.
Well, if we can figure that out, then I guess we can put an end to all philosophy, and we've solved all of the world's problems. But I think this is actually a really, really productive space from which to look at this work. We've hinted at some of the different ways in which one can think about creative expression as political, and I'm going to ask you to maybe try to untangle a little bit a concept that was coined, in my understanding, by another artist called Ganzier, and
Hmm.
this is the idea of concept pop
Hmm.
as a genre or a kind of technique for dealing with realities,
Hmm.
which I think is a very apt way of describing what it is that Hani Rashid does.
Hmm.
So there's not really an easy way of asking this, but I have to take you to this kind of very, very simple understanding of how artistic creation is political or it isn't.
Hmm.
There are moments in the book where you refer to Theodore Adorno's understanding of committed art, that is
Hmm.
art that's sort of instrumentalized. And I know I've put quite a lot of terms into one,
Hmm.
but if I could ask you to muse a little bit about ways in which either the body of work that we just talked about from Hani Rashid,
Hmm.
or maybe a series of paintings called Bulldozer,
Hmm.
help us to understand a little bit these
Hmm.
nuances. It will be fantastic.
Yeah. Um, I think that one conclusion that I came to in my research about these creators is that certainly many of them are directing or sort of expressing some sort of social critique, cultural critique, political critique in their work. But this is really only part of what it is they're trying to do. And while it's certainly interesting to think about, say, for example, the way that Hani Rashid is critiquing aspects of life in Cairo, it's also really fascinating to think about um, sort of how he comes to create these particular aesthetic forms, how he uses color, because he's not just, for example, he's not just offering a critique. He's also, in some ways, sort of celebrating the sort of beauty in the chaos as well. All the color in people's clothes, all the color in the objects that the cars, the motorcycles, the ordinary sort of street scenes. And to a certain extent, the color is also related to his interest in surrealism. And often surrealist painting has these very vivid and sort of striking, if not even clashing colors that jolt the viewer. In a way, he's using colors in those ways, but in other ways he's using the colors in a way that's pleasurable, in a way that's sort of imagining the beauty of, or celebrating the beauty of, the objects that human beings create. He does this perhaps even more so in his project called Gypsum Museum, in which he creates these absolutely exquisite images, or rather models, miniature models of cars, of vehicles, out of gypsum, a wooden gypsum, and they're almost sort of photographic in their
Mm.
accuracy, and they're rather beautiful, a way of sort of celebrating what it is that human beings can create when they make machines. But then he'll also have exhibits or little parts of the exhibit in which these cars have gotten into a crash, for example, and so the once beautiful cars are mangled and destroyed, and and so he's sort of getting at you know also the vulnerability of not only human creations but human experience itself.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, as much as there isn't any overt political context in Hani
Right.
Rashid's work, there is a kind of pushback against the restrictions of creativity.
Hmm.
And I think that brings us reasonably neatly to one of the writers that I thought we could speak about,
Hmm.
and that is Menat Al-Arsami,
Hmm.
who seems to do exactly that. Like the thematics of her work are deeply personal. But let's introduce Menat and how she maybe sits in a tradition of new writing and new imagination in Egyptian literature. Manat was born in 1983. Yet another artist, yet another writer who studied a different subject. She was a zoologist, and I think that has a interesting bearing on her creative output.
Yes. Yes, and she is actually a writer that I have met sort of more recently in my career studying writers in the city. Indeed, a very fascinating and brilliant young woman with degrees in zoology and chemistry, and um, she's also an immunoparasitology expert. And in fact, she is either I think she may have finished her PhD in immunoparasitology. So fascinating background, studying the natural world and its or the biological world, the animal world, insect world in its relationship to human beings. And she's also worked in writing and journalism. But what was perhaps most fascinating to me about Menatollah was that she began writing flash fiction, which, as probably many the audience would know, it means very very short stories. Flash fiction can even be a sentence or two. It can be 50 words, 300 words, something like that. And the idea behind it is that the flash fiction writer isn't presenting a plot per se and is not doing any sort of character development, but rather is really focusing on image and emotion. Manatallah's stories are fascinating because they often draw upon ancient Egyptian themes and imagery. One of my favorite stories that she wrote uh, basically takes place as a woman is walking around an ancient Egyptian site,
Mhm.
and she suddenly has an experience of sort of, you might think of it as time travel. She becomes a figure from ancient Egyptian history as she's walking around this site, and she experiences what the Egyptian queen Nefertiti would have experienced in a particular point in her time when the temple priests were conspiring against her and her family. Again, it happens in a very, very short period of prose or a piece of prose with this sort of remarkable economy of words, but she gets at what it may have been like. She imagines what it may have been like for this very powerful woman to feel absolute vulnerability at a particular time, a political, a particular political moment in ancient Egyptian history. So it's very evocative, very interesting, often focusing on issues of vulnerability and pain, often focusing on women's vulnerability and pain.
How can we situate that within a broader literary scene of Cairo and Egypt? And I was
Hmm.
very struck. You cite some conversation with Manat Allah, and it struck me like with the density of words like human beings and the pain, disappointments, frustrations, catastrophes, melancholy,
Hmm.
revolt against restrictions. I mean, it's a really, really dense interest in pain,
Hmm.
a desire to represent and unpack and picture pain.
Hmm.
This is just one author we're looking at, but I have a feeling from your descriptions of Another writer in the book, and or from the critics that you cite and relate to, is there's quite a lot of engagement in the literary scene
Hmm.
in these kind of fractured narrative,
Hmm.
which very often end up with these very painful or at least emotionally charged moments.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, the larger literary world in Cairo is, as I've said before, extremely active and extremely experimental. So you have authors who are working again with the movement between colloquial language and formal language, which is the basis of most Arabic literature, the formal, al-Fusha, the formal literary language. You have people exploring historical texts and including um, pieces of historical texts within their own contemporary writing as a way of sort of getting at the movement between present and past, different times in the Arabic language when language was has been used differently, different styles, drawing parallels between the past and the present. And I think that's one of the things that Menatollah does so well is that she imagines the past as a way of not making simple connections to parallels in the present, but suggesting ways in which human experience continues on certain kinds of lines. Human beings tend to oppress each other. Women have tended to be in many ways dominated in various societies, not just in Egyptian society or Arab society. But despite all that, women have continued to find ways to be active, to find ways to be creative, to revolt and resist. And I think that that's part of what she tries to bring forward, that even in human vulnerability, there is this immense sort of existential strength that people are capable of, which continues to move them forward.
Mm. I think one of the things I'd like to ask you about is the relationship between the state and the institutions that support these practices. You mentioned at various points galleries like Townhouse in Cairo, which is internationally renowned, and moments where there was political pressure on the gallery to avoid certain types of political content. Some of the artists you addressed in the book referred to censorship in the work. So I wonder whether you could address a little bit the state's relationship to all these kind of formalized activities, but also maybe use it also as a way to introduce the final chapter of the book, which looks at informal creativity, particularly street art in Cairo, which I think we know from images of the revolution and thereabouts is actually an incredibly rich area of activity in the city.
Yes, it's a topic that's a delicate one. Um, what I think I can say about this is, particularly when I first started doing research in Egypt in the 1990s with authors, um, a great many of them were supported by state prizes for their literature. They worked in the bureaucracy, in the Ministry of Culture in various capacities. They may have been editors of literary journals or regular contributors to those journals. So there was a sort of dance between creators and the state. The state supported creativity to a certain extent, but writers also would tend to know their own boundaries, what could be talked about and what could not be talked about, um, in order to be published and to maintain a sort of status vis-a-vis the state. One example I can think about in particular, this is in the Mubarak era, was an author, Namat al-Bahiri, who was very interested in how we can think about female sexuality in a conservative society, in a patriarchal society, and how writers can write about and explore the difficulties, the challenges, the richness of female sexuality without being censored. So because there are certain things that are just not publishable, and she did get it, she did back in the Mubarak era have some issues with censorship for when she wrote about women's sensuality and desire. Um, in the current context, again, there are still, state galleries, institutions, prizes, which have been written about in a great bit of detail by by a literary critic called Richard Jacquemont, who has investigated the relationship between writers and the state in great detail. I think that self censorship is an important aspect of understanding what it is that writers and artists can do. In Cairo, they know quite well, although not perfectly, um, the limits of what they can explore with regard to society and culture, um, sort of without getting into trouble.
But in the street, is everything up for grabs on a
Well,
street
I
wall?
mean, that question is so interesting because for most of my 30 years of spending time in Egypt, there really was no street art, no graffiti, nothing. And it was, in the years leading up to the revolution where you started to see a little bit more of it, but mostly during the actual revolution where you saw massive amounts of beautiful murals, murals that were painted by professional artists, but also murals that were painted collaboratively by groups of artists and ordinary people. Spending time in Egypt around in 2012 through 2014, some of this work was still up, and some of it was even preserved by the government, as sort of a monument to the revolution. But there were two particular street artists that I found uh, really fascinating. There's a wall very close to Tahrir Square. It leads into Tahrir Square, in central Cairo, along Mohammed Mahmoud Street, which was also the site of a very brutal battle during the revolution. But one artist who goes by the name Hima Alaga, he did a painting that he calls Citizen, and it's sort of loosely sort of structured around the image of Leonardo da Vinci's very famous sketch, Study of Human Proportions. And so he represents a human being, with arms outstretched in various positions in the way that Leonardo da Vinci's sketch does, but he puts an ancient Egyptian headdress on the body. He also represents the body as wounded in various ways, as the body has been wounded. The Egyptian body has been wounded, in the revolution and before and after. And he incorporates a number of symbols from ancient Egyptian um, painting, such as a fish, for example, um, and other aspects of sort of coloring that clearly refers to ancient Egyptian aesthetics. So it's kind of a way of sort of thinking about the history of human experience, not just in Egypt but more generally. It's a way of thinking about the beauty of the human body, again, the vulnerability of the human body, um, and also sort of bringing in the sort of majesty of the ancient Egyptian past as a way of maybe asking questions about, you know, where where the Egyptian citizen is going, um, you know, going forward after the revolution.
Well, that's a big question on which to end. Caroline, thank you so much for your time. I just want us to end by asking you about your research now and what you're working on next. I presume you are going to come back to Cairo before long.
Oh yes, I am very anxious to come back to Cairo. I also have a project. I'm working on a new project in Jordan, looking at Jordanian and Palestinian women writers,
Hmm.
which is a something that hasn't been published about as much. Jordan has a more recent literary sort of scene, um, but a very fascinating one, and one that involves writing about the movement of people, whether we're talking about um, the Bedouin who are indigenous to Jordan, the Palestinians who've moved in and out of Jordan because of their refugee status. Um, Armenians, and so on. So that's one project I'm working on, but I'm also writing a book with some colleagues here in Milwaukee about the Muslim community here in Milwaukee, which is a more traditional ethnographic anthropological study of placemaking, the ways in which Muslims have made a place for themselves in Milwaukee, which is a very racially segregated city, one that experiences quite a bit of racial tension. So it's sort of about how Muslims have found a place in the particular sort of racial landscape of Milwaukee. And I also talk about a number of artists, Muslim artists in the city who are making making a place for themselves through creativity as well.
I think I noticed on the website of the choir project that you brought them to Milwaukee as
Yes,
well. So I guess you
yes,
found a way to connect all
I
these
did.
interests together,
I
which
did.
is really
Yes.
beautiful. Well, fantastic. Caroline, thank you so much for your time and the conversation and for your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in the book. It was really wonderful to have a chance to talk about it.
Creating Spaces of Hope, Young Artists and the New Imagination in Egypt by Caroline Seymour-Jorn is published by the American University in Cairo Press. My thanks go to Salam Yusri for his permission for us to use one of the songs from the choir project. I'm Pierre Dalancet, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time.